Riley woke to the scream still tearing the dark, a jagged ribbon across her thoughts. The room smelled like cold dust and foam plastic. Her screen lit, bright as a tiny door. Dana said, "Bad dream again?" Riley said, "Someone said my name." The house hushed, as if it had ears. A new text arrived, time-stamped to the minute. It repeated a sentence Riley had never spoken aloud. She tasted iron and counted her breaths. Jess had warned her to ignore unknown numbers. The message typed 3 dots, then stopped, then typed again. Riley said, "How would they know my locked note?" Wind moved the blinds and made a quiet, bone-dry click. The word hello appeared, followed by her name, spelled like only family spelled it. Dana knocked, and the letters vanished. Riley said it was nothing. The phone pulsed once, like a heartbeat in her hand. Morning arrived pale and thin, like someone had wrung the color from it. Riley biked to school and counted cracks, trying to keep her mind from the message. Jess said, "You look like you slept in a blender." Riley laughed, then failed. The next text landed as the bell rang, predicting a spill by the lockers. She told herself coincidence loved attention. A boy dropped a thermos and coffee burst like a muddy firework. And Jess said, "That was a guess, right?" Riley said, "It was a lucky timestamp." Phone hummed again as if it disagreed. She tucked it deep and felt it pulse like a trapped insect. Jess said, "Block them." Riley said, "It is not a normal number." The hall smelled like bleach and panic. She kept moving and did not look back. They hid behind the theater curtains where sound went to die. Riley whispered the line from the text and waited for disbelief. Jess said, "Who else knows that phrase?" Riley said, "It lives in my locked note." The curtain breathed with the vent and made the space feel alive. A reply came with a screen cap of the note, cropped to the word she feared. Jess said, "That is not possible." Riley said, "Then make a better word." The dots danced again and printed a private nickname from childhood. She felt small, like a suit she had outgrown overnight. Jess said, "We tell an adult now." Riley imagined the word adult falling through a trapdoor. A bell clanged, and the phone's time matched it to the second. Silence pressed in with the velvet. Home smelled like tomato soup and late rent, a familiar blend that tried to calm and failed. Dana said, "I can call in late if you need me." Riley said, "I need you to pretend it is fine." The TV muttered daytime courtroom drama, all verdict and no mercy. A photo arrived of their hallway from last night. It showed the rug skewed and Dana's slipper turned wrong. Dana said, "Who took that?" Riley said, "Someone who does not need doors." The furnace clicked, and the lights dimmed, just once. Dana touched Riley's cheek, then her phone, then nothing. Riley said, "Do not worry." Dana said, "I am supposed to." The house held its breath with them. The phone placed a new message, in notes like a pinned moth wing. At the station, fluorescent lights buzzed with insect patience. Detective Monroe said, "You want me to chase a ghost number?" Riley said, "I want you to trace a voice that types." He tapped keys and frowned at returns that were not returns. He said, "There is no carrier on this log." Dana squeezed Riley's shoulder in a rhythm from years ago. Monroe said, "Block, report, document." The next text came and repeated his desk passcode. He stared as if the room had moved. Riley said, "It knows the inside of places." He said, "Do not feed it." The message typed, then deleted, then wrote her name with the family spelling. Monroe stood and closed his office door very gently. The lock clicked like a verdict. Riley sat in Detective Monroe's cramped office again, the blinds cutting sharp bars of shadow across her face. Monroe said, "This is prank-level nonsense." Riley said, "Then why did it give your passcode?" His fingers drummed the desk until they stilled. He pulled up network traces, nothing but static loops. He whispered, There's no tower on this map. Riley said, it always arrives on the minute. The buzzed at 6:15, screen flashing a sentence Monroe had scribbled in his private notebook. He froze pale, hand pressing the leather cover. Dana asked, so it is not just a game? He shut the notebook hard and said, it's a break-in without a door. Riley felt the air grow heavy, as if the office itself leaned closer. The fluorescent lights above flickered once, then held steady. She said, now you believe me? He rubbed his jaw and muttered, belief isn't the word I'd use. Riley noticed the pattern first, counting seconds like beads on a rosary. She said, it comes every day at the same time. Jess leaned across the cafeteria table and whispered, that means it's a ritual. Riley whispered back, or a sentence. At 12:17, her phone throbbed. The message ordered her to place her math book on the floor. She ignored it, and 2 minutes later a tray collapsed behind them, plates smashing in a spray of soup. Jess said, coincidence does not stack like that. Riley set the book down, her hand shaking. Another text blinked. Good. Riley said, if I miss one, it punishes someone. Jess swallowed hard, eyes wet. The noise of the cafeteria dulled around them, as though the room was waiting for more. Riley felt her pulse fall into sync with the seconds on the clock above. That night, Riley scrolled through forums under a pseudonym, searching for anything that matched her terror. A username, CalebHart77, answered her post within seconds. His words were careful, too careful. He wrote, the rules keep you alive. Riley asked, what rules? The reply came, same time, every day, obey or bleed. She dropped the phone onto her blanket and whispered, how do you know this? Another message, I lived it. Now I pass it. Dana knocked and asked, homework? Riley said, talking to someone who already died. Caleb wrote again, you're next in the cycle. Riley's chest tightened. The cursor blinked, waiting for her next question, but her hand stayed frozen above the keyboard, as though the wrong keystroke might summon something closer. Riley sat across from Sheriff Hoyt in the diner booth, the air thick with fried grease and stale coffee. Hoyt, eyes red-rimmed, said, you kids should stop stirring ghosts. She said, it isn't a ghost, it texts me. He grunted and lit another cigarette, though the sign forbade it. He whispered, back in 3, another teen came in here crying about the same thing. Riley leaned forward. What happened to them? Hoyt said. File went missing, just vanished. He slid his cup back and forth, leaving coffee rings like shadows. Riley said, you closed it. He said nothing, just looked at the window's reflection. Dana said, why hide this? He muttered, because no one survives it, and because it learns you. Riley stared at him and realized he was already broken long before her arrival. Jess thought she could help. She said, I showed the messages to some friends. Maybe they know tricks. Riley felt her stomach empty into cold air. She grabbed Jess's wrist and hissed, you what? Jess said, it was only to keep you safe. A ping came before Riley could breathe. The screen displayed the group chat transcript in real time, messages appearing word by word. The unknown sender wrote, secrets taste better when shared. Riley whispered, it watches everything. Jess whispered, I didn't know. Dana arrived at the table, confused by the tears running down both faces. Riley shoved the phone away, but it vibrated again. A final line appeared, never betray me again. Riley's throat closed, because she now knew the texter was in the room, in the wires, maybe even in her blood. Riley read the directive twice, then a third time, as if the letters might soften. The message said to leave the back door unlocked at midnight. Jess said, it is bait. Riley said, it is a rule. The clock moved like wet glue. Dana brewed tea and spoke about locks without naming fear. Riley said, for one night only. Dana said, doors mean we get to choose. The phone replied with a single word that felt like a finger to the lips. Midnight arrived and sounded thin. Riley stood at the door with her breath caged. Jess texted, begging for refusal, promising to stay on call. Riley turned the bolt and felt the house exhale. The night pressed its face to the screen, cold and damp. Dana said, "We will sleep in shifts." Riley nodded and did not sleep. The phone purred as if pleased. A silence followed that did not feel empty. Morning came brittle and colorless. Riley checked the door and relocked it with shaking hands. A new text chirped, late by seconds, scolding like a school bell. Riley said, "I obeyed." The reply said, "Prove it tonight." She felt the trap widen. That evening she refused, heart thudding like boots on steps. Dana said, "We choose safety." At the stroke past the rule, a crash broke the street calm. Mr. Bennett cried out, and metal scraped pavement. Riley and Dana ran to the sidewalk and saw the ladder twisted under him. Riley whispered, "It punished him." Jess called, voice choked, asking what happened. Riley said, "I locked a door." Sirens cut the air while the message arrived with a word she could not unread. It said, "Consequence." The word sat in her mouth like a coin gone sour. The waitress poured coffee without asking, like mercy. Across the booth sat Mrs. Klein with hands folded, as if hiding a tremor. Riley said, "You got the messages too." Mrs. Klein looked at the window and not at faces. She said, "They are not messages. They are debts." Dana said, "How did you survive?" Mrs. Klein said, "I stopped trying to win." She traced circles on the formica, each one smaller. Riley said, "What does it want?" Mrs. Klein said, "Pieces of you it can name." Jess asked, "Can we starve it?" Mrs. Klein said, "You will feed it by thinking about it." The diner's hum seemed to grow teeth. Riley felt watched by the silence between words. Mrs. Klein slid a paper with a list of hours and days. She said, "Patterns pretend to be mercy." Riley folded the paper and felt her pulse follow the numbers. That night, Riley set decoys like mousetraps, placing 3 phones with cloned apps. Jess said, "If it bites, we tag the bite." Riley said, "If it reads minds, traps do not matter." She baited each device with false notes and wrong memories. The room felt like a stage where the audience breathed too loud. At the appointed minute, only Riley's real phone lit. The others stayed inert, cold glass under warm lamps. A reply arrived, finishing a sentence Riley had not yet typed. Dana whispered, "It is inside the thought, not the phone." Riley swallowed and tried to think of nothing, which turned into a flood of every secret. Jess pressed her palm to Riley's shoulder like a brace. The typing dots pulsed, as if sensing to her heartbeat. The message ended with a private daydream Riley had never shared. The trap had never been for a device. The next morning, Riley found a new file pinned in notes like a moth on velvet. She tapped, and a lullaby flowed out, thin and close, with a soft hitch where grief lived. Dana stared and touched her throat. Riley said, "He used to hum that in the hall." The audio contained the creak of their floor and the click of their vent. Jess whispered, "It recorded this morning from inside." Riley felt the house shrink around the sound. The message below the waveform said, "I remember your door." Dana said, "That song belongs to us." The phone answered with a second clip, this time whispering the family spelling of Riley's name. Riley set the phone down, as if it might bite. The silence that followed was not silence. It was breath held by walls. Riley followed Caleb down the dirt road, fog chewing the edges of the fields. The farmhouse waited, like an open mouth. Caleb said, "It always starts here." Riley said, "I heard my name inside this place before I woke." Dana carried a flashlight that looked too small for the dark. Jess whispered, "This place feels like a bruise." The air smelled like rust and mildew, wet boards breathing under their feet. Caleb kicked a broken step and said, "It remembers the ones before you." Riley said, "How do you know?" He smirked without answering. Inside, a floorboard groaned as though dragged by invisible weight. Dana said, I do not like this. Riley said, neither does the house. The silence afterward carried something more than emptiness. They found the records box in the sheriff's archives, dust thick enough to choke. Riley flipped through faded papers while Dana held her breath against the mold. The files spoke of teens who vanished, each case stamped with Hoyt's name. Riley said, these were all like me. Jess said, why are the boxes cut open? Dana said, because someone wanted them gone. The missing folder was heavier than the ones left. Riley said, Hoyt buried it. Jess whispered, or fed it to the same thing. Riley traced the ink with her fingertip and felt a cold trickle as if the letters still lived. A page slipped free with a burned edge, curling toward the floor like it wanted to escape. Riley caught it and whispered, it does not want to be read. Dana's voice cracked as she spoke. She confessed she once reported a man who shadowed Riley as a child, watching from sidewalks, never close enough to touch. Dana said, I begged them to look into it. Riley said, who? Dana held the faded police slip. The case was stamped closed by Hoyt. Jess whispered, he buried more than files. Riley's skin crawled with the thought that the eyes from childhood had not left. Dana said, I thought I had protected you. Riley said, you kept me blind instead. The silence pressed until even the refrigerator hum at home sounded hostile. Riley stared at the slip until the ink blurred. She realized the shadow had never been a stranger, but part of the cycle. Riley picked at the blackened phone they had found buried under floorboards. The shell was warped, melted by fire, but inside the casing glimmered the carved digits of the ghost number. Jess said, no SIM, no carrier. Still it speaks. Dana said, phones do not brand themselves. Riley pressed the casing and swore she felt warmth. Caleb whispered, it carries fragments of them, voices that never leave. Riley said, it is a vessel. Jess stepped back as if the thing might breathe. Riley said, it does not want to die. She dropped it on the table, and the glass cracked beneath it. The screen flared once without power, showing 3 dots pulsing. Riley said, it is watching even now. Riley opened the old camcorder file left on the charred memory card. The tape showed a toddler version of her babbling nonsense syllables in a living room filled with outdated furniture. Dana gasped, hand to mouth. The child repeated a name, broken but clear. Caleb's last name. Riley said, that is impossible. Caleb leaned forward and said nothing. Jess whispered, she knew you before she met you. Riley felt time fold like paper cut wrong. The laughter on the tape soured into static, then stopped. Riley whispered, why does it know you? Caleb smiled faintly, but never answered. The silence that followed weighed heavier than truth. Detective Monroe traced the static signal to the farmhouse, but even unplugged, the router still whispered. He said, no power, no cables, still it speaks. Riley said, it is not in wires, it is in air. Dana rubbed her arms as the static crawled through the room. Jess whispered, it is like it breathes. Monroe hooked meters to it, watching needles twitch where no current should exist. He muttered, this thing should be dead. The device blinked once, a faint green eye in dust. Riley said, it is alive because it remembers us. The walls groaned, nails squealing inside the beams. Dana pulled Riley close and whispered, do not answer it. Riley stared at the blinking light until her pulse matched its rhythm. Mrs. Klein met them in the church basement, voice rough from sleepless years. She said, it is called the Archivist. Riley asked, what does it want? Klein whispered, to keep everything. Secrets are its food. Dana said, can it be starved? Klein said no, but it can be traded with. Jess said, traded what? Klein said, moments, names, memories. Riley felt her scalp prickle, as though something already took a piece. Klein showed scars along her wrist, pale marks like words erased. Riley said, you fed it yourself. She nodded, eyes hollow. Riley whispered, what happens if we resist? Klein said. It punishes everyone near you until you give in. The room was cold, though the heater hummed. Caleb leaned in the corner, arms crossed, while the others spoke. Riley said, "You knew about this long before." Caleb smirked and said, "I lived because I passed the torch." Dana said, "You recruited her." Caleb said, "It needs a host, and hosts need replacements." Jess gasped, "You gave it names?" He said, "Better them than me." Riley felt bile rise, the betrayal burning hotter than fear. Dana whispered, "You are its servant." Caleb smiled, "I am its survivor." Riley clenched her fists, wanting to break the smugness. Caleb leaned closer and said, "Your turn is almost finished. You will carry it, or you will vanish like the rest." Silence pressed tight around his words, and Riley realized he was both warning and curse. Dana unfolded an old envelope, the paper thin as skin. Inside were letters warning about 7 cycles. She whispered, "I kept them from you." Riley said, "Why hide this?" Dana said, "Because knowing makes it stronger." Jess said, "We needed this earlier." Dana's hands shook, the paper rattling like dry leaves. Riley read aloud, "6 cycles test loyalty, the 7th binds." Monroe said, "You are already at 6. Riley felt her throat close as the words dug in. Dana cried, "I thought if I ignored it, it would die." Riley said, "It does not die. It waits." The letters smelled of smoke, edges singed. The room darkened, though no lights were off. Riley whispered, "We are almost finished." But finished means what? At midnight, the phone vibrated with a new message, longer than ever. Riley's chest tightened as she read. It said, "You started the fire." Images flickered, barn collapsing, heat roaring, screams blurred by smoke. Dana whispered, "That night." Riley said, "I was too young." Jess said, "This is a lie." Caleb's smirk sharpened as if he already knew. Monroe frowned, "Or it is a memory buried." Riley shook her head, but the scent of ash filled her nose. The text repeated the words again, then added, "You belong to me." Riley's breath came shallow, the ground unsteady under her feet. The truth was twisted, yet it clung like tar. She whispered, "If it is true, I was the spark." Dana held her close, but Riley felt colder than fire. The phone buzzed at 11:59 and carried a demand colder than steel. It read, "Confess by midnight or Jess will take your place." Riley's pulse spiked, her breath ragged. Jess whispered, "It's bluffing." Riley said, "It never bluffs." Dana grabbed Riley's arm, voice trembling. "We can find another way." Monroe paced, muttering, "Every curse has a rule. Every rule, a trapdoor." Caleb smirked from the corner, whispering, "This is your 7th cycle." The text repeated with a countdown timer, ticking seconds away. Riley's fingers shook over the screen, words hovering unsent. Jess said, "Don't do this for me." Riley whispered, "It has already chosen." The air felt sharp, as though the house was filled with broken glass. Silence bled between them, waiting for her answer. Riley confronted Caleb in the farmhouse ruins, storm clouds above rumbling low. She said, "You survived because you gave it others." Caleb leaned closer, smile razor thin. "I offered a handover. That's the bargain." Dana spat, "You are feeding it children." Caleb shrugged, "Better than being its corpse." Jess shouted, "You're proud of this." Caleb whispered, "I'm alive, aren't I?" Riley felt fury choke her. He extended his hand, palm up, as if offering salvation. He said, "Take the right, pass the curse, and live." The storm cracked, lightning slicing the dark. Riley stared at his hand and felt the weight of every missing name. Monroe unfolded his plan like a map. He said, "We trap it with a Faraday cage, give it nowhere to go." Riley whispered, "And if it breaks out?" He answered, "Then it kills me before you." Dana muttered, "We are not offering sacrifices." Monroe snapped, "I've lived my whole life doubting. Now I'll act. Jess said, what if it eats through walls? Monroe said, we'll see if steel can pray. Riley nodded, her heart pounding like war drums. The farmhouse was wired with copper mesh generators humming low. Each wall hummed with static like bees behind plaster. Riley whispered, this is our cage. Midnight hit like a hammer. The archivist screamed through every device at once, screens flooding with Riley's secrets. Photos, messages, dreams she never voiced all spilled into light. Dana stepped forward, whispering, take me instead. Riley shouted, no! The doors slammed shut, locks clicking by themselves. The air pulsed, glass vibrating. Jess covered her ears, sobbing. Monroe fought to stabilize the circuit, sparks jumping his hands. Caleb laughed darkly, saying, it likes mothers. Dana pressed herself against the cage wall, absorbing the blow of the static as the lights blew. Riley screamed her name, but the dark swallowed sound. Riley stood inside the trembling farmhouse, phone blazing in her hand. She spoke the words Caleb whispered earlier, the handover right, her voice shaking. The static shifted, listening. Then she twisted the chant, changing its final phrase. The archivist roared, every bulb bursting in shards. Riley said, I bind you here, not me. The farmhouse groaned like a living beast chained. Jess screamed, shielding her face from flying glass. Monroe shouted, it's working, hold it. Caleb snarled, you'll doom yourself. Riley kept speaking louder, until the power crashed. For one breath, silence reigned, and the cage held. Riley had 1 hour of quiet, forged from chains and sparks. She stacked every device in a metal bin and smashed glass until her hands shook. Jess said, it is trapped, make it count. Dana said, we end it now. Monroe doused the farmhouse with fuel, jaw set against doubt. Riley said, no more doors for it. The match hissed like a warning, then bloomed. Heat climbed the walls, roaring over old sins. Jess said, walk away. Dana pulled Riley into the yard as windows burst. Monroe said, if it slips, we run. The roof sighed and folded, timbers collapsing in bright ruin. For a breath the night went still, and the fire sounded almost grateful. By noon, the ash cooled to a black ribcage. Monroe photographed melted boards and the gutted router shell. He said, this is the report I should have filed years ago. Dana said, we start telling truths. Riley sifted cinders until her fingers found the carved digits, now blistered and unreadable. Jess said, if it wakes, we have our proof. Monroe sealed evidence with hands that finally stopped shaking. He said, it will not be another rumor. Riley stared at the ruin and felt the hours still ticking somewhere. She said, it remembers us. Jess said, then remember back. Wind drove ash across the field like gray rain. The farmhouse exhaled one last hot breath and fell silent. Evening found them at Riley's kitchen table, hands around mugs that did not warm enough. Jess said, I remember messages I never saw. Riley said, it tried to root through you. Jess stared at the wall as if a screen lived there. She whispered, there were words using my mouth. Dana said, you are here. That is enough. The heater rattled like thin bones. Jess said, if it asks for me, do not trade. Riley said, it already took too much. Silence sat with them like a fifth chair. Monroe texted a photo of the sealed box and wrote, evidence secured. Riley breathed and felt something breathe back. Jess gripped her hand and held on as if clocks could be stopped. Near midnight, Riley opened a blank post and watched the cursor blink like a metronome for fear. Dana said, say only what you must. Riley typed a confession shaped like smoke, all edges, no flame. She wrote about mistakes without names, about doors and silence, about choosing to stop a fire without saying one ever burned. Jess read and nodded once. She said, it is enough for a rule, not for a court. Riley pressed publish and felt the room tilt. Monroe replied, "Timer stopped on my end." Dana said, "Breathe." Riley closed the laptop and waited for judgment from machines and walls. Only the fridge hummed, and even that sounded tired. The house held its breath until the phone woke on its own. No SIM, no setup, just a single notification. Riley said, "Do not touch it." The screen displayed day 17 and a thank you she did not want. Dana said, "We finished this." Jess whispered, "Or started something else." From the hallway came a faint rhythmic drag, like something heavy learning the floor. Riley stood, and the sound paused. She said, "It knows the new route." The message brightened once, as if pleased. The heater clicked off, and the silence turned thick. Riley whispered, "We will outwait it." The drag resumed closer now, then stopped outside her door, and the lights dimmed without going out.